Okay, good morning everyone. Hopefully you had a good night last night. Hopefully not too good because I can see you're here so early in the morning. Okay, so my name is Will Corbett. I'm a teacher of English as a foreign language. And about 3.5 weeks ago, just under a month, I finished my CELTA qualification. So I finished training to teach. And this is the CELTA here that I'm going to tell you about today. And I'm going to tell you why it's a really good idea and why, if you're interested in teaching English as a foreign language, it is the gold standard in getting into the industry. There is no better qualification on the market that employers will look at and think, that's the teacher I want to hire. Okay, so you know that the CELTA is a teacher training qualification, but just to go through some details, so it was formerly known as the Certificate in English Language Teaching to Adults. That's where the CELTA abbreviation comes from. A few years ago, they did change the name here to Certificate in Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages, but the abbreviation doesn't really work, so CELTA has kind of stuck ever since then. So it is designed for those with little or no previous teaching experience, but believe me, they will make you work for it. They're not going to make it easy, they're going to drop you in at the deep end, and trust me, it is the best way to learn. You don't want to be eased into it. So you get 120 contact hours. I believe it works roughly the same if you do the online option, but I'm afraid I'm not much of an expert on that one. And you will do 6 teaching hours. So you will do mostly 40-minute lessons, and then at the end of each stage, which there are 2 of, you will be doing an hour-long teaching session. So you will teach 2 levels. In my case, I was teaching a beginner, elementary kind of group, and I was also teaching a pre-intermediate group. But don't be fooled, even the beginners speak a really quite decent level of English. You will be able to have conversations with them, and you will be able to get to know them and have a really nice chat with them. I mean, the best thing you can do with your students is just have a laugh first thing in the morning. Okay, so fees can vary. I paid about £1,500, so that works out as about 1,750 euros. But I've heard anything between about, let's see, the dollar amount was what I heard, so anything between about $1,200, so I think that's about 1,000 euros or so, anything up to 2,700. I've not seen many places charging 2,700. I hope there's not many, but that's the horror amount that I've heard. So it can be done part-time over 7 months. That's what I did. And there is also an intensive option of 4 to 5 weeks. Only do the intensive option if you absolutely have to. Because the way my tutor put it is if you do the intensive option, it won't just be the students crying, it'll be the tutors crying too. So it is tough work. Even over 7 months, don't be fooled by the part-time label. You will be putting in a lot of work. It may only be 1 day a week at college, but the amount of time you'll be spending planning, researching, doing assignments, it does add up. So it is a big commitment, but it is absolutely worth it if it is something you do want to consider. Okay, so my background. As the course was designed, I have no prior teaching experience, unless you want to count the 3 days that I did at the end of secondary school, when I spent 3 days sticking up posters for the teacher as part of work experience. So not really teaching experience, to be honest. So I've got an undergraduate degree in politics and international relations, which I loved. And I think the international relations side of that really contributed to my love for languages, for looking outside to the wider world. And I think that's why I've actually ended up in the position that I am, where I do enjoy learning languages, I do enjoy teaching English, and I really love hearing about all the experiences my students have. A lot of them are refugees in the UK, come from Afghanistan, Syria, Ethiopia as well with their current civil war, and some of the stories, they can be quite harrowing sometimes, but absolutely fascinating, and the students are often very willing to share. And I think one of the best things you can do as a teacher is really open up. Let them tell you their stories, and they want to hear about you as well. They absolutely love hearing about their teachers. So if you like talking about yourself a bit too much, maybe this is the job for you, I don't know. I did actually also start a master's degree in journalism, and COVID hit about halfway through, and I took a look at myself, and I was like, I quite enjoy this course, but can I actually see myself being a journalist? not being able to switch off, 24 hours a day, keeping an eye on Twitter, Facebook, and everything else. I realized it wasn't a job for me. And I've also got professional experience in hospitality. Believe me, I have worked my fair share of cafe and bar jobs. I only finished my last one about 1 month ago, actually. And it's a great experience. I think everyone should have the experience of working in hospitality, dealing with customers, that sort of thing. But believe me, I am glad to be out of it. This teacher training qualification really has opened up my opportunities. And I've also got professional experience in policy research. That was more while I was doing my politics degree, did lots of things on business policy. Yes, it is as boring as it sounds, and it meant I was sat at a desk all day, which I'm quite a fidgety person. I really like standing up. I like standing up, talking to people, just like I'm doing now, just like I do in my lessons. And the idea of being stuck behind a desk for the rest of my life, it really is not for me. Okay, so kind of touching on what I've already mentioned, but why did I want to do the CELTA? So I've always had a fascination with languages. I still remember, I think the first ever time I tried to learn a language was, I'm a 1997 baby. In 2006, I remember Italy won the World Cup, and I was on holiday in Cornwall in the UK at the time, and there was this tiny little bookshop in Padstow that my family used to love going into, and I went into there, and I was like, right, I'm going to learn Italian. So I got this tiny little, I think it was one of those old Berlitz phrase books with Italian, and I think I managed to learn maybe 5 phrases, and I don't think I remember a single one of them. So that was my first very successful experience with language learning, the first of many. Okay, and like I said, I just really needed a job that didn't leave me stuck behind a desk. And yeah, like I said, I was doing a master's in journalism, my background was in policy research when COVID hit, and I was like, I need to do something that I can really enjoy. I'm the kind of person where if I don't enjoy something, I can't make myself do it, which is quite a bad habit, but sometimes you just have to adapt. Okay, so the CELTA process, so the interview process. So I should probably touch on the application as well. The application is really quite simple. You'll be sending in something like a cover letter, you'll be sending in the very standard CV kind of stuff. And they do say the standards are quite rigorous for who they select. Obviously, they have to take into account the fact that these people will largely have little or no prior teaching experience. Although I will say there are quite a few people who do end up on the course who have taught for a number of years, but tend to have taught in other areas instead. But if you do get selected, so they'll be looking for you to have strong writing skills. But believe me as well, if you're not a native speaker, that is not a barrier at all. There were 12 candidates initially on my course, whittled down to 10 by the end, but no one failed, luckily. It was all personal circumstances why we went down to 10. And yeah, I think out of the 10 of us that were left at the end, there were, I think 4 of them were non-native speakers. I think 1 Urdu speaker and 3 Arabic speakers, if I remember rightly. And funnily enough, they were actually, I would say, the strongest candidates on the course. I actually think they're better teachers than I am. And they're not native speakers. And I do think that really lends itself. If you're a non-native English speaker and you want to teach English, I think that's really good because you understand things about learning English that I just don't know. I mean, when it comes to a lot of the grammar concepts, I learnt it as I went along. I hardly knew what an adverb was when I started this course, so don't worry if your grammar knowledge isn't the best, you will learn it as you go along. I mean, I've started my first teaching job now, I'm still learning a lot of grammar concepts, so it's nothing to worry about, and there is a really good course as well that your tutors will recommend you if you do start this, by a woman called Jo Gakonga, and she's just the godmother of English language teacher training, I would say. She's got everything you could need. Okay, so like I said, there are rigorous standards. You will be going into a group interview. If you're like me, you'll be going in there with 3 other people, and what you will be expected to do is you will be expected to teach the other 3 candidates something. Now, this could be anything. I went with something language related. I taught them 1 to 3 in Chinese. You only get about 5-10 minutes to do this. I taught them 1 to 3 in Chinese, briefly touched on the tones in Chinese, and I taught them the characters as well, because if anyone does know any Chinese, you will know that the characters for 1 to 3 are literally just 1 line, 2 lines. and 3 lines, so nice and simple. From those 4 that were interviewed in my group interview, I was one of 2 people accepted. And I still can't quite believe that, because I thought the 2 candidates who got rejected were actually really quite strong. So, yeah. And then you will also have, yes, your pre-prepared teaching task there. But like I said, it can be something non-language related as well. I mean, the other candidate who got in for my group interview taught us how to draw a perfect 5-point star in the space of, I think it was 5 seconds or something like that. So really quite a bizarre task they chose, but it worked, and they got on the course, and they were a really good candidate. Okay, so beginning the CELTA, you will be given some pre-course tasks. It's about a 30-page document. Most of it you will sail through, but there is a grammar section, and believe me, even if you know your grammar, it is not the easiest. You are meant to have it done before day 1 of the course, but there's always a few candidates where they'll push it a little bit, leave it until a week or 2 into the course. But to be honest, as long as it gets submitted by the time that you start your assessed practice a few weeks after the start of the course, you should be fine. And what you will also do is, so you will start off with, I should have that the other way around actually, so you will start off with a tutor observation. They will teach the group that you are going to teach, and you will watch them. So for me, it was when the COP Climate Change Conference was on at the start of this academic year, so that would have been about October, November 2021. So my teacher taught a lesson based on climate change, lots of words like drought, things like this being introduced, and this was a pre-intermediate group, so this was a really good conversation for them to have, and it gives you a good idea of exactly what an experienced teacher does. I mean, my 2 tutors, I think they must have had, let me think how long they've been teaching, must have had best part of 80 years teaching experience between them. You know, these were really good, experienced tutors, and that will often be the case with CELTA, because believe me, if you have not had your practice, you are not going to get accepted as a CELTA tutor. So anyway, following on from the tutor observation, you will then have your own unassessed teacher practice. So when you do your first half of the course, when you have your first group, you will do your unassessed teacher practice with your other candidates in the same group. So in my case, I have 4 other people in my group, and you will do a round-robin kind of process, and you will teach some fairly basic skills to the students. In my case, it was a simple reading task, do some marking, do some feedback, and it's as simple as that, really. And then when you get to the second part of the course, you will do the unassessed teaching practice alone, but by that point, most people tend to be pretty confident, and even those that aren't, they have got the ability, they just don't really realise they have it yet. And we also go over some basic teaching techniques. I mean, one of the first things you will do is you will learn what a really good warm-up activity is. Just something simple. I always find it quite funny because I use them all the time in my lessons now. We will get kids down to the front. They'll be like, oh, do I have to get up? It's Monday, it's 9 a.m. Well, actually, to be fair, in Europe, it's usually about 8 a.m., so it's even earlier. And you'll be doing simple games like back to the board, having them guess things, 20 questions, things like this. So you do start off simple, but believe me, it does speed up quite quickly. Okay, so like I said, you will teach 2 levels. So my first group was a pre-intermediate group, so I would say there were some really strong B1 candidates in that group, but I would say they were mostly high A2, low B1. So they're just on that point where they're getting fairly decently conversational. Okay? So like I said, you'll start each level with a session of unassessed teaching practice, but I will say, now luckily this is something that was one of my few strengths when I started, because I was actually quite weak when I started out, but one of the good things you should do right from the start that thankfully I got right is you want really good monitoring and feedback skills, because the fact of the matter is when you're doing some of the more complicated concepts, if you make a go for them early on, that's all well and good, but bear in mind you may not do them that well. So one of the best things you can do is just building rapport with your students. Don't be afraid just in the 5 minutes before class or the 5 minutes after class. Have a conversation with them. Ask them what they did for the weekend. Ask them what they're going to do next weekend. And they do really appreciate it. And they'll often want to hear about your life as well. I mean, all the time when I'm doing my lessons, I'll put in a little something like, for example, the other week I was teaching a lesson about talking about the past. And I used the example of when I was 8. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find any embarrassing photos of myself when I was 8, which I would usually do. So instead, I put my brother on there, which he is still not forgiven me for. He looked very, very cool. He was wearing a suit, glasses, kind of a Blues Brothers kind of vibe. And the students love it. My brother, not so much. Okay. So the assignments, God, I loved the assignments. And by loved them, I mean absolutely hated them. I am not an assignment kind of person. So you will be doing 4 assignments. Some people love these. The people who love grammar, me not so much. The people who love grammar tend to absolutely love the assignments. So you'll start off with the language-related tasks, which will be split in 2. And that'll be vocabulary analysis first. Vocabulary analysis. I do know one person that failed this one, but I would actually say it's probably the easiest of the 4, well, technically 5 assignments. On the note of failing assignments, you are technically allowed to fail 1 assignment and still pass the entire course, but there was one person from my course that failed 2, and he was still allowed to pass the course because he had strong teaching practice. So honestly, as long as you compensate in other areas, it doesn't matter if you're a little bit weak somewhere because you will get better as the course goes on. Then we have the grammar analysis. I passed this one by the skin of my teeth, to the point that my tutor in my feedback even said, "You have done just enough to pass this assignment." I should note as well, so what you will do is you'll have a first submission. You'll have a first submission, which is kind of like a formative assignment. So you'll submit it, you'll get feedback. The amount of people that pass on the first submission, even if your assignment is amazing, is very, very low, because it was never explicitly said by our tutors, but you got the sense that even if your assignment was ready to pass, they would send it back just so you could improve it that little bit more. And then you'll have your second submission, which is final. And that will be your final grade. But I should say tutors are very understanding. It is mostly parents, actually, who tend to do this course, so they understand that we have lives, we have things to do, things get in the way, especially with the last couple of years. So they will understand, and if you do need extensions, they are very, very forthcoming with them. So if you do miss out, if something comes up in your family life, do not worry. I know people who fell so far behind, and they had so much support catching up again. You then have the skills assignments. The skills is kind of like a planning assignment. It teaches you how to structure a really good lesson. So in our case, we were looking at reading skills. And let me tell you, after I did this assignment, my reading lessons were absolutely on point, because lessons can seem quite difficult for someone who's never actually done much planning before they start this qualification. But a lot of the time, it really does follow the same kind of structure. So you can copy and paste this, and believe me, once you learn the structures of the various lessons, it will, I would say it would halve your planning time, but to be honest, it would probably reduce it by about 90%. Then you will have focus on the learner here. So what you will do with this one, this was my favorite one, but it is also really quite difficult. So what you'll do is you'll interview one of your students from the group you are teaching at the time of the assignment. You will have the choice of whatever student you want. Unfortunately, my first choice already got jumped on by another candidate. So I went with my second choice, and she was an absolutely fantastic interviewee. Her name was Kathy. She was, let me remind myself, so she was born in Malaysia, but ethnically Hakka, I think if I remember rightly, from South China, but didn't speak any Hakka, but spoke Cantonese, Mandarin, but couldn't write in any of her native languages, but could write fairly well in English. So she was a really interesting candidate. Really quite smart, actually. Don't let the lack of writing in Chinese confuse that at all. She was really quite strong. And you get to find out these amazing things, not just about their language, but also about they themselves. But one of the things I always remember is we have to analyze what they say in this interview, and we have to pick up on mistakes and say how we would address them. So in this case, Kathy kept talking about Chinatown in Birmingham, about going out to Chinatown with her friends, and she kept saying Chinatown, Chinatown. She couldn't pronounce that N right at the end. And because I'd done a little bit of Mandarin before, I was able to say, this is because the aun syllable ending doesn't really exist in her mother tongues. But ow, without the end, does. So just little things like that, if you can pick up on those, really do help. And then you have lessons from the classroom. If you fail lessons from the classroom, it comes right at the end of the course. If you fail it, you've got no one to blame but yourself. It is extremely simple. It's a glorified self-reflection. As long as you actually put the time in to do it, you shouldn't have any problems at all. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about the first set of teaching sessions. So you will change usually around, if you do the part-time course, you will usually change around January, February kind of time. So this time I was teaching a, not beginner group, but near beginner group. And I was going in there thinking like, oh my God, I've had such good rapport with my first group. How on earth am I going to speak to them? They speak hardly any English. Believe me, they are a lot better than you think they are. So you will need to be careful with how you grade your language. You want to use the present simple as much as you can with these lower level kind of groups. But if you just keep it simple with some of the past questions you ask, they will understand quite well. One of the things that we found quite difficult on the course is we had these people from all over the world. And here's us in the middle of Birmingham with really quite thick Midlands accents in England. So sometimes it was a little bit of a struggle, but we always got through. So at this level, concept checking questions and instruction checking questions are even more important. So CCQs and ICQs you will never hear the end of during your teacher training with the CELTA. So the concept checking question is helping students to understand what a word exactly means. So if I, say for example, want to teach a student the word warm, I could say, is warm kind of hot, kind of cold? And hopefully they would say, oh, it's kind of hot. And I'll say, yes, okay, so you kind of understand that concept. And then with instruction checking questions, if I've just told someone to read through a passage, and I've told them to read quickly, I can say, okay, so are you reading quickly or are you reading slowly? And hopefully they would say quickly. So the run-in, okay, so the run-in isn't the worst part, I would say. There's a point around February where the assignments do build up a little bit, so I would say make sure you've got things done well in advance for them. But when you get to the run-in, the main thing you need to do is get your portfolio in order. You do have until the final day of the course to do this, but don't do that. Do not leave it to the last day of the course because you will have forgotten some piece of paperwork, something like that. So keep your folders in order. Make sure you keep hold of as much stuff as you can. And you shouldn't have any problems getting it signed off on the last day of the course. So you'll also need to have your teaching observations signed off. So you'll be doing, let me see, I think it was 6 hours of experienced teacher observations. And these, so in my case, because I did the course post-COVID, they've started to do it now where you'll do 3 of these sessions in person, but then 3 of them will be online. The 3 online ones are really quite simple. You just have to watch the recordings online. But the 3 in person, you will be seeing experienced teachers, probably at the same college that you're doing the course at. And these can be a real mixed bag. So you go in there thinking like, oh, I'm going to have this astounding time. And I did have one of these experienced teachers where they were absolutely fantastic. Learned so much, I immediately applied it in my next teaching practice. And there was another where all they did for the entire, I actually stayed for 2 hours of the session because I wanted to see what would happen. And they had one student do a presentation that entire time. Now, kudos to the student, it was an excellent presentation and their English was very, very good. But it is not constructive for students to be doing presentations for that long, especially not at an intermediate kind of level. And as well, just keep on top of your assignments. Don't worry if you have failed 1, possibly even 2, and certainly don't worry if you fail things the first time around because absolutely everyone does. And then job hunting as well. So the job hunting, you will need to be on the button about this. They do leave the job hunting part of the course until quite late. So me, for example, I knew I wanted to go into work straight away, so I've been hunting since maybe January, February. But if you do wait until they do the session on it, you will not be doing it until about April, May. So if you need work immediately after the course ends, you are going to struggle if you leave it till then. Okay, so continuing professional development. So this is kind of UK-based. I don't really know what particular qualifications there are in many countries, but this is what we would typically do in the UK. So the Delta, as you can probably tell, is very similar to the CELTA. It's the diploma. Usually you'll get at least a few more years teaching experience under your belt, and then you would do the diploma. Okay? You could also do a PGC in education. That's typically what we get as a teacher training qualification for normal schools in the UK, not for language schools, but it can be very helpful. There's the TILEC as well, which is the Teaching Young Learners Extension Certificate. That's designed as a bolt-on to the CELTA or to the Trinity TESOL, which is similar to the CELTA. That will help you teach anything from tiny little kids right the way up to 18, or you could get a master's in TESOL, which I know a few of my course mates already had. Okay, so my first teaching job, so I am now a teacher of English as a foreign language with English in Action. So I teach week-long courses to students across Europe. I've just got the train from Berlin yesterday. So I've been teaching in Berlin for a couple of weeks. And I was also teaching in the Netherlands, and then I'm off to Austria next week, which has been great fun, but all that traveling is absolutely shattering, let me tell you. Okay, so post-course reflections. Only do the intensive CELTA if you absolutely have to, because from what I've heard, it's what it says on the box. It's very, very intensive. Don't be perceived by the part-time label. You need to put the work in. You will learn grammar as you go along. Even just a pass is a very good grade. Pass A and B are very hard to achieve, and not many people will get them. CELTA planning does not reflect realistic lesson planning. You will not be planning in the real world for 8 hours per lesson. I think I spend maybe 20 to 30 minutes on the usual lesson now. And also just don't get complacent. Keep on top of your work and you will be absolutely fine. Okay. Perfect, so if we can move on to the question and answers now. So let me see. Okay, so I'm just going to take these questions from online first, and then if anyone afterwards wants to ask any questions from within the room. Okay. So what is a contact hour? So a contact hour is any hour, whether it's when you're teaching or it's when you're learning, that you spend inside college, when you spend actually on the course. So you're not going to be spending 120 hours teaching, far from it. You will spend 6 hours teaching, but you will spend entire afternoons going through various concepts, things you can do. I think we spent a whole afternoon learning Swahili one time just to show us how you could learn a language without actually understanding any of the instructions in that language. I still remember the Swahili word for banana is ndizi. And so you're talking about a particular school. Where is it? Okay, so I went to South and City College, Birmingham in the UK, so right in the heart of Birmingham. Good location. Bit of a pain commuting for me personally because I actually live in the next city over and they weren't running their course for some reason. But for the vast majority of people, they lived very close to the college and it was very convenient. There are hundreds and hundreds of centres across the world. I actually think there's more in most countries than there are in the UK, to be honest. So you will have no problem finding somewhere, but you will find the ones abroad will more often do the intensive CELTA. So just bear in mind what I said about the workload if you do choose to do that. And what is unassessed teaching practice? So it's when you're teaching a lesson, in the first set of teaching hours, it will be teaching practice that you do with other teachers at the same time. So I was paired with one of my other teachers and we were teaching reading skills. But then for the second set of teaching practice, when I was teaching the lower level group, you will teach the first hour alone. And all that'll be is you'll be teaching a lesson, but you will not be graded based on it. It will not count towards anything at all. You are not going to fail the course because your unassessed teaching practice didn't go very well. Okay, any questions from within the room? Mm-hmm. Yes, that's absolutely fine, no problem. Okay, anyone else? You mentioned working in Germany and Austria. Are you doing short-term contracts? How do you find the work? So what happened here was my tutor on the course actually recommended a company that had approached her called English in Action, as I said. So this is short-term contract work, so I can be doing anything from a 1 week up to a 6 week contract. So I'm currently in the process of doing about 7 weeks, but that is divided into some 1 week contracts and 1 4 week long contract. So as a British citizen, you can imagine being ever so slightly affected by Brexit when it comes to finding work in Europe. So it is difficult, but thankfully, because of the nature of my work, because I'm hired by a company in the UK, I can just go out on my usual Schengen allowance, which is I'm allowed to be in the EU 90 days out of every 180, and then it resets. So through that, I can do these short-term contracts, and yeah, it's great fun. I've been taking a couple of overnight coaches to try and save on accommodation here and there, because my hotels are usually paid for, but not always for the Saturday night. So every now and again, I take an overnight coach to get between contracts, and believe me, it gets pretty tiring. Okay. What was the hardest thing about getting the certificate for you? I think it was the sheer number of hours of planning. I mean, I was working part-time in a coffee shop at the same time, and I started off that coffee shop job doing 3 shifts a week, thinking like, oh, this will be easy, no problem. I've got this, this leaves plenty of time for me to do my lesson planning. I had to go down to 2 shifts. It is a lot of work, even just for a part-time course. So yeah, the hours can be really intense, but it is a case of putting the hours in and you will get there. So I don't know if it's fair to call that the hardest thing about the course. So the hardest thing about the course, I would say that grammar assignment. You are actually limited to about 1,000 words with each assignment, but in the case of the first assignment, which is split, you will have 500 words for each assignment. Trying to do a grammar assignment with 500 words is not possible. You will go over the word count. Don't go too far over, because they will refuse to mark it, but I think I submitted my 500-word one with about 800 words, and I did only just about pass it, but I did pass it. So don't be afraid to go over the word count, but for example, one of our students had a 1,000-word assignment and wrote 5,000 words. Don't do that. The tutors will not mark it. How much do you hate teaching the present perfect? See, coming into the course, I thought, yes, this would be the really, really quite awful part, having to teach all the grammar concepts sort of thing. I'm very much an immersion-based learner, so I usually avoid learning grammar deliberately. But I actually found it quite all right, really, because before I started the course, I wouldn't have been exactly sure what the present perfect is, and now I know what it is, and I think it's all right, really, because you can have a bit of fun with it, really. You can often turn these things into games with the students, and yeah, it's just something where, as you go along, you learn. No? Okay then, well, thank you very much for listening. I know it's been quite early, but I do appreciate you coming here. And if you are interested in training to teach, hopefully this has given you a good bit of insight. I'm just going to put the presentation back up on the board. Ask me any questions. I can, like one-to-one, you can ask me right now as well. I'll be out there in a second. But if you do want to contact me instead, you can find me on Twitter at ultralingual. I don't use Twitter as much as I used to, so you're probably best off sending me an email at wtb.corbett@gmail.com. Well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.